AI has become our new savior, and there's a reason why AI has become our de facto mythology of the future. I think it's because we've given up or literally incinerated the possibility of any other kind of future, because AI is this perfect, amorphous idea that can fit into the shape of whatever problem you want to stuff it into. Hey everybody, welcome back to Unseen Unknown. I'm Jasmine Bina, my partner Jean-Louis Rollins. Today we're going to talk about dead futures. So every once in a while, it might happen that there's a cluster of events that happens in culture, and it changes the direction of where that culture is headed. And we might not know where we're going, but we know that we're not going any longer in the direction that we thought we were going in before. And futurists talk about this through the futures cone model. But I think an easier way to look at it is like a tree, right? The branches of time. And the metaphor we want to use here is that we have some freshly cut off branches that we need to pay attention to. If you play in culture, if you're a leader, if you're in politics, in any arena of life, because a lot of brands and leaders out there right now are still playing as if those branches exist. And a lot of those branches won't come back. If they do come back, they're not going to look the same. So today we're going to discuss what's been cut and where we're headed now. And we're going to talk about a few domains. The age of achievement, we'll talk about AI, we'll also talk about beauty and motherhood. So let's start with age of achievement, Jean-Louis. Get us rolling. What do you think has been culled there?
We did a book club at Exposure Therapy a little while back, reading Deep Utopia from Nick Bostrom. He's the guy who wrote the book on superintelligence, kind of a seminal book and set of ideas on AI. Not the most exciting read, but some really thought-provoking ideas. And one of the points he brought up is he's exploring essentially, let's say that we actually end up with a good case scenario, right? Let's say that we get technological maturity, which is really profound and powerful, and it really solves a lot of problems. Well, what are the problems that you have to deal with then? And I've seen this in a few different kind of lenses as we explore it, but essentially, Western society, especially the US, is completely oriented around achievement, right? Everything is around individual achievement. You see that in kids' activities where it's no longer group sports, it's individual pursuits. You see that someone's self-worth, who do you want to be when you grow up or what do you want to be when you grow up? It's really the question of what is the great accomplishment you want to have? Everyone aspires to solve something. I'm going to cure cancer. I'm going to discover a new particle. I'm going to do this and that. And so we've kind of built society around achievement. And his argument, and again, we see it elsewhere as well, is that we might be moving away from an achievement-oriented society. And I think that has incredibly profound consequences. And so there are sort of two ways you can look at meaning. I like to call them type 1 and type 2 meaning. So type 1 is achievement. It's a one-way door. I brought us through a thing. Now we know a thing we didn't know before, or we can do a thing we didn't know before. Think of all the foundational AI models, right? That's like a new intelligence. That's achievement. That's type 1 achievement. The other is we had a really nice time together, So there's a sentiment analysis bot that looks at, especially on X, how do we measure happiness? And the most consistent measure is Christmas. Christmas has this very universal spike. It's higher than everything else. So you can measure the general positive sentiment as that new album is a 0.2 Christmas, right? Or whatever. You can see how that's a unit of measure. And so type 2 meaning is about the quality time together. It's hosting Thanksgiving. It's deep conversation. It's ritual. It's sport. It's entertainment. It's joy. It's play. It's a two-way door. You can come back over and over again. And here's what's really interesting, especially with AI. We built our society around achieving things. And now AI is going to be doing a lot of the achieving, right? And so there's already early stats that AI might boost productivity, but it's also killing our job satisfaction. You see this in varying extents in different places, but, in certain scientific fields, there was one study, and it's 17% boost in productivity, 82% drop in work satisfaction.
Wow.
So pretty significant. And the point here is just that there's a lot of forces here that as we move further and further away from achievement, as achievement becomes less fulfilling, but also there's way more of it. So if, just to get into this for a moment, especially if you look into medicine and deep sciences, AI is accelerating the amount of achievements, but it's truly mind-blowing. If you really get into the frontier papers that are coming out and the new discoveries. So, there's so many different things with drug discovery, with medicine discovery, with new kinds of proteins that we can develop, with new kinds of antibiotics, new treatments. all sorts of just new ways of understanding imaging, running simulations of cells, simulations of atoms, new astronomical discoveries as well. It's just a lot of the foundational science that you can then build upon is exploding, right? And so I think what happens is twofold. One, achievement becomes maybe slightly less satisfying in the age of AI. But two, there's so much more of it that becomes slightly less novel, right? Like, oh, yeah, last week we cured type 1 diabetes. Next week we're going to cure this, and then we're going to cure that. And it sort of becomes less significant in the landscape because there's so much more of it that, like, the point here is that I think very gradually we're going to be orienting ourselves differently as to, what we organize our attention and society around. And the last thing I'll say on here is, so John Vervaeke has this lecture series on...
I was just going to mention him. Go ahead.
on the meaning crisis, awakening from the meaning crisis. And this is an anecdote I bring up, but I think it's so interesting, right? What's really interesting, we love Greek mythologies. What we don't love is Egyptian mythology is the same. And why? Because we cannot relate to them, because there's a big difference. Greek mythologies have the concept of progress. Egyptian mythologies don't. They are cyclical. I live, I die, and the world goes on as a cycle. And that is very unrelatable to us. The psychotechnology of progress is huge. And progress is all about type 1 meaning, right? And I think what's really interesting is if we keep going down this road of super mature AI, and maybe this is a really big, long, further out take, but type 1 meaning becomes less and less important to us. And as it does, the cyclical mythology becomes more relevant to us, that, the world doesn't change as much if you kind of look away from that. If we look at like what we're orienting towards, and I think you see that in a lot of small trends, the friction maxing, the distancing from the capitalist machine, the slow life, a lot of that is a type 2 meaning orientation.
This feels like a much longer time horizon in terms of cultural change than we usually study, because I think it would take a long time to decouple ourselves from this idea of achievement and more towards the type 2 meaning. And you're talking about two things happening at once. One, achievement becomes less possible as the market changes, as the world of work changes, technologies replace people. But also we'll become habituated to so much progress that's not done by humans. Mm-hmm. It becomes irrelevant to us in an interesting way. And it feels like when I try to embody what that world would feel like, it feels like a divergence. Like there are two worlds. There's a world where all this progress is happening and it's the machines and whoever, the tech leaders. Yeah. And then there's the people who are left behind to reconfigure what meaning means to them. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about the branch that's being cut off, which is like how you identify your value in the world, right?
Yeah, I think so. How we organize ourselves. Yeah.
Right. That's a big challenge for a culture to figure out how to reorganize themselves. And you're right, we see experiments, but they're very small. Yeah. Like the whole American mythology of like the frontier and the West and manifest destiny, none of that jives with what you're discussing.
Yeah, I think it's like at the base level, the one of the most fundamental questions, right, is like, who do you want to be when you grow up? Which is to say, what do you want to achieve? And I think that there's the question that I would say, and again, this is like, we're talking about the tectonic plates of culture. These are gradual but massive movements. And the question is like, how do you want to feel when you grow up? And I think that like when you think about how profoundly different that is and what the consequence of how you pay attention, and I'll give another lens to help understand this. A sort of side quest of mine is exploring folklore and cultural practices around the world, especially indigenous communities. And the thing I notice is that you see it everywhere. Humans as a species, as an animal, we love to sing. You see it in all of these different places. We sing like the birds sing. We're very musical. And you know what's so weird is our modern, especially Western relationship with singing. If you are not good at singing, you shouldn't sing. That's how we perceive it because we see it as an achievement-oriented thing. We see singing as it's only worth doing if you're going to achieve something, which is to say, if you're not very good, don't do it because you won't achieve anything. And, you think about that of like, these indigenous communities, they don't care if they're good or not. That's not the point at all. It's an orientation around what does it mean to sing with other people and to connect with them. And I think that metaphor of how we relate to singing is that orientation. And I think that is a much more profound thing than we realize as, again, like, and the other thing is, take the other extreme, Ray Kurzweil's singularity, the whole idea that the rate of human knowledge doubling is itself accelerating, right? It's like we double human knowledge, like it used to be like every 10 years and that was every 5 years. I think it's maybe around the order of like 3 or 4 years, human knowledge in aggregate doubles. What we don't really pay attention to is when that comes down to like less than a year, human knowledge doubles, at less than 6 months, it becomes boring. I think that like we don't realize that like, sure, yes, we're going to cure this disease and that disease. And I think it's just that like those are great things. Those are objectively fantastic, wonderful things. Yes, we should cure these diseases. But I think it becomes less exciting in that like, I'm going to dedicate my entire life to this, and it's less of an orientation for us. And I think that's the point. It's not to say that the progress isn't good. It's to say that it's not the operating system that we're organizing society around.
Another way of looking at the organization that I thought of while you were talking is everything we do is about quantification. It's, capitalism. We should like literally like that should be the booby word. But like, if you can't measure it, if you can't extract it, if you can't package it, then it has no value. And you could argue that's what's gotten us into a lot of messes culturally where we're at right now. But you're asking people in this vision of your future that you're talking about to resist measuring things, to resist quantifying them.
I think it's different units of measurement, right? Like the challenge is that when you can have a clear metric, then, you tend to track it. But, we're talking about the felt experience. We're talking about meaning and joy and these kind of things, which obviously are the substance of the experience of life, right? If you can't experience meaning and joy, what are we even doing here? These are the things that matter, but they're hard to measure, right? And so they're hard to commercialize and, capitalize upon. And that's kind of the issue that I think that there's a recognition, right? Like the pushback and the narrative against capitalism is, the fact that like we're recognizing there's a lot of things that are missing, there's so much in the domain of like spiritual awakenings and personal journeys that people are going on. And this is the second order consequence of that. As everyone does the self-work, there's this different orientation. I was just watching a clip from, Brian Johnson doing psychedelics. And his point was like, he was concerned that a lot of founders who do psychedelics, they don't want to run their businesses after the trip, when they do like a hero's dose. And like, that's the thing that we're talking about here, is what is the orientation of your life? And it's just interesting that like, especially with psychedelics, there is this renegotiation of that, what are we prioritizing here? We touched on this in our last episode about aspiration, about how the broken contract between work and reward, right? That like, hard work doesn't necessarily equal reward. This whole point of, achievement and type 1 meaning is essentially a commentary on that to say that like the achievement isn't maybe worth all the effort, right? And that like the worth of the achievement is changing, the economic value, but also the cost of it, right? The labor, the hustle, the grind that, you work really, really, really hard. And like, is that actually the thing that's going to fulfill you? And I think that it all sort of comes together in terms of how we aspire, how we look at the balance of work and reward.
All right, let's move on to the next one, which is related to this, which is AI itself. So I have been thinking about what is happening here in terms of futures that are dying. And I wrote recently about how I think there's definitely a clear argument to be made that we've lost a vision of the future where people collaborate on scale to solve real problems. We've had the last decades to solve our climate crisis. Now we have a water crisis, wars, oil, whatever you want to throw at it. Consumerism, the many different things that are unsustainable in this world. And we are reaching a point where we can see, like, what is it on that doomer clock? We're at like 11:59 and 59 seconds. We're seeing that maybe we're incapable of it. And instead of continuing to try, AI has become our new savior. And there's a reason why AI has become our de facto mythology of the future. I think it's because we've given up or literally incinerated the possibility of any other kind of future, because AI is this perfect, amorphous idea that can fit into the shape of whatever problem you want to stuff it into. I don't know that AI will save us. Of course, I hope like anybody else that it will, but truly we don't have any inclination of whether it actually will or if it will in time. And that's the future, the dead future I want to talk about. This future that, we are going to wake up one day and realize like our resources are precious. All of the ecological concerns that we have in the world right now, we're going to have some sort of like I said, collaboration on scale or at scale that would help us kind of start reversing the damage that we've done. I think it's safe to say, especially with AI here now, that's a branch that's been cut.
So you're saying that we're no longer going to be able to collaborate at scale?
I'm not saying that we're no longer going to. I think our belief in that future, the belief that we will be able to turn back the clock, that we're going to start conserving and respecting the planet and respecting life. I think that's been replaced by this idea that like AI is going to solve our problems. AI will help us find a near infinite energy source. It'll help us figure out the game theory of like, different cultures and, finding peace among people. That's what I'm talking about.
So it's essentially, I mean, it's the mythology, I think, came from DeepMind, their mission statement from way, way, way back, like well over a decade, which is solve AI, use it to solve everything else.
Exactly.
Right.
There you go.
That's basically the dominant mythology that you're saying. And so to clarify, what is it replacing? Like, what have we lost here? Like, what's the branch in a sentence that's been cut here?
Okay, so the next branch that I want to talk about is something that's been on my mind, and it's anything having to do with like ecological brands around sustainability, brands around, social responsibility, anything in that category. And it's this idea that we used to have a lot of little branches about like, what it meant to, be a future of a culture that like conserves and respects the planet and protects our resources and dials back the doom clock that, we're at the 11th hour, 59th minute. It feels like all of those little branches and all these campaigns and efforts to make people care and, protect our world and our environment have fallen off. And now it's all collapsed into this one big branch, which is like AI is going to save us. AI is this technology where if we can just shove it into any problem we have, we'll have a near infinite power supply. We'll be able to create world peace. We'll be able to, solve the plastics problem or the recycling problem or the water problem. Yeah. And that's a lot of faith to put into something that could not get here soon enough. And it's amorphous, so it fits. It fits into the shape of any problem we have. And it feels like it's killed off some other futures.
Yeah, no, I 100% see that. It is like, from the lens of mythology, it is our savior, right? Like every problem has an AI-shaped hole. And it's really because the AI, as you say, it's amorphous. It can fit into any hole, right? And so we do that. And, I always think back to that Emerald episode talking about our relationship with AI and how he was kind of jibing that it's a bunch of engineers in Silicon Valley who want a father figure, and they're rebuilding that for themselves. But even he's using it there in terms of the emotional landscape. But I think 100% the mythology is it will provide these grand solutions to us, and I think it's very related to that whole point about the types of meaning and achievement, right? That it's going to achieve all of these great things, and there is an argument there. But I think the interesting word you used is faith, because I think that is what that is in large part, because the reality is still very far from it. I was just hearing there was an AI safety study where they ran a very specific simulation of events where there's like kind of a nuclear threat and they're a political decision maker. And I think it was like 21 out of 23 of the experiments, they launched the nuclear missiles first. And they were like, no, ceasefire. And then they did it behind their back. Like, I mean, it's really interesting to see, as they run these simulations to see how they behave. It's fascinating because we put so much faith in it, but it is a mirror of us at the end of the day. And I think that we don't reconcile that,
Yeah. It is interesting how AI has become basically our de facto mythology of the future. And I think something that's important to note is that mythologies, as abundant as they may sound, as abundant as AI may sound, every mythology is born of a constraint. That's why we create mythologies, because they help us maneuver around a constraint in a way that is narratively continuous for us, in a way that helps us understand the world. And that's kind of like the dirty secret behind this mythology of AI. It is obscuring the very real constraint that we have around collaboration and working at a level or on a scale that would solve a lot of these global problems. And we've basically given up on any hope of that. We've incinerated those other futures.
I think the reason why it's become such a sharp mythology for us that everything has snapped to, it's because our relationship with the future is so strange to us right now. Like, it just, if you just zoom out 100 years ago, everyone's expectation of the future was to do what their parents did, right? Like your career choice was farmer, maybe something else, but probably farmer, right? Like the future looked exactly like every past generation. And we are the very first generation who the only thing we know about the future is it will not resemble the past. And that, I think, it is impossible to understate how disorienting that is. Like every religious every structure, container of meaning and storytelling doesn't fit the shape anymore, right? Like we're in uncharted waters, right? And we know that like the climate's different, work is going to be very different. We're at a declining population very soon in a lot of developed economies, if not already, and that changes the very premise of capitalism when growth is not the default. You've got this meaning crisis, you've got this post-reality, you've got, even just the prospect of like longevity or even just the longevity escape velocity. Like we simply I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how long I'm going to live. I don't know what planet I'm going to be inside of. Like you cannot underestimate the uncertainty of all of those things. And the only common factor is we can be pretty sure AI is going to show up in each of those buckets.
Yeah.
It's probably going to do something with climate change. It's probably going to be involved in longevity. It's probably going to be involved in work. It's probably going to be involved in meaning. And so it's the only thing. Like I feel like there's just like we're kind of falling and it's the only handle to grab onto. And so it just makes sense that with so much uncertainty, it's the only thing that's probably going to be around, right, as we navigate the future. And I think that is the vacuum and the reason why AI is why it's become the dominant narrative.
If you're a brand in any category that's impacted by this, especially categories that are dealing with big, complex, global systemic problems, you have to know that this is what you're competing with now, is a mythology that promises a near instant result. So ideas of like incrementalism, slowly fixing things together, personal responsibility, they all feel quite quaint. And they also feel irrelevant because it feels like the world is burning down. We don't have time for those things. It almost feels naive to think that we have time to solve problems by stepping things back slowly. And I think that's a challenge that a lot of these brands are facing.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, there's two sides of this. I mean, the challenge that we have now is that we know the models that we have don't work and they won't work into the future, right? Like, for example, just take climate change. Like, we have to do something different, right? And there's a lot of debate of what that different thing is, but we just simply know we can't do what happened before. We have to do something new. And so we're in this in between, right? And I think we're in the in between in so many different territories of we know it's going to be different. We know it's not what it was already. And we are deconstructing everything, but we're in that messy patch. It's kind of like a kid who takes apart the old Lego model before they build the new one. There's just all these pieces. And we know that they have to go together somehow. And I think that is the chaos of this liminal space we exist within, right? And as a brand, it's like, the one thing we can't handle is uncertainty, right? We need certainty. And so again, coming back to that word faith, when we think about AI, right? Like we simply don't even know what the new models will be. We just have faith that AI will be involved in it. And we're generally optimists as a species. And so I think that's kind of the notion here. It's just, it's just, these are huge deconstructions.
Okay, let's talk about the last couple of dead futures, which are related to each other. They're both basically big parts of the female experience, which is beauty and motherhood. So starting with motherhood, I don't need to over-explain that a certain kind of vision of the future of motherhood where we kind of like repair and tweak and like, if I could just optimize this and get that right, or do a little bit better than my mother, I'm going to be the best mom and my kids will be happy. That version of the future seems to have died considering all of the questions around female autonomy, bodily rights, like we've discussed here in the past, everything that's in the Epstein files. And there's been a big uptick in the discussion around this idea of matriarchy, or at least living within a patriarchy, or what it means to raise children within a patriarchy. And I think that's really come to the forefront. It's a conversation that's been around for a while, but I'm just seeing these words more and more, and people are very comfortable with them. And a lot of matriarchal experiments, matriarchal societies, matriarchal communities and clubs and literature. And that's been interesting to see because I think it shows that like we've cut this branch, but we're working really hard to create a new one really quickly.
Yeah. I mean, last on our last episode, we talked a lot about how anxiety shapes so much of this industry, but for very good reason, So I think this is really impactful. The Meta lawsuit that just happened in New Mexico, where they essentially what they did is they created precedent for a new type of harm, behavioral harm through neglect, right? And so this is a very big deal. It just happened. But basically what's happened is we now have legal precedent that companies like Meta and Google have, through intentional negligence, harmed children, right? Or expose them to exploitation and danger in a very active way. So there was a jury. It took them one day after reviewing all the stuff to come to that decision. There are now 1,600 lawsuits that are coming from different school districts and different areas, basically with the same point, which is that these platforms harmed our kids.
Yeah, but aren't these things just going to get like repealed or settled out of court? All the usual like
this
going
is
away.
this is a categorical new thing. So there's so Jacob Ward has been covering this in a lot of depth. His whole notion is that this is the big tobacco moment for social media, where we now have, because we know that it's been harmful, but now we have legal precedent that makes every other case much easier, because now it might go to the Supreme Court. There's probably going to be some lobbying, but the bottom line is that the court case that already went through is $375 million in damages that they have to pay. There are 1,600 court cases just like that coming. So think about that like there's going to be a lot of fighting, just like there was with big tobacco, right? But now it's a different conversation. It's not, does it harm? It's like, how much does it harm? Now we have the vernacular, we have the language to quantify this. And so, again, it's this point of like, this is all about safety, right? It comes back to safety and this idea that like, I think for a lot of mothers and a lot of parenting, a lot of women, there's two paths. Can we repair it or replace it? And repair is gone. Like that branch of the future is gone. There's no repairing this. We need a step function change and we need to do things very differently. And I think that, to your point, is a very big shift, right? There is no incrementalism. There is no like wellnessing your way there. There is no grab bag of D2C brands that are going to solve this. Like you can't, millennial aesthetic your way out of this. Like I think it's a really big deal that we need new foundational systems and approaches. And so it comes back to the points about like the mommunes, right? Intentional co-living and communal, spaces. And, homeschooling is getting really, really big right now. And we're kind of reassessing how we think about that. And I think the subtext of this, which is really important on the parenting side, is that the US is a very young country. It's 250 years old. Relative to a lot of other cultures, there aren't deep parenting norms. We don't have deep expectations. There isn't like a wisdom tradition to lean on here. It's all just been sort of hodgepodge together. And so the whole point is that like, there isn't a long precedent to replace here, I think that we're in this phase of replacing the whole model, to your point of like there's no incrementalism. It's a new branch that we need.
Another thing that I think people underestimate is that the minute a public gets a little taste for justice, a little taste, I'm not going to say vengeance, but a little taste for retribution and for being witnessed, having their suffering be witnessed and realizing they're not crazy and this is not going to be forever a losing battle, then you start to get real steam.
Yeah.
And I think that's why this case matters. Of course, it creates legal precedent. Of course, it's going to be messy, and there's so much money and political power that will push back on this. But now people, it's like kind of like, this is a strange connection to make, but I remember somebody shared once, a lottery ticket isn't a lottery ticket. A lottery ticket gives you that feeling that for whatever the days are between when you buy it and when the numbers are announced, in those 2 or 3 days, there is a pathway to the kind of future you want. Like there is a possible pathway, and I think that's what this is the same thing. I'd hope it's more secure than a lottery ticket. But now there is a possible pathway that has just appeared.
Yeah.
And now people can actually kind of like see there could be a way towards the future we want.
Well, I think too that like, coming back to like safety and parenting, like technology has dominated the experience of childhood, right? And so, what happened in Australia with the ban of social media and it's being discussed in a lot of other countries. And now we've got this precedent of behavioral harm as a category of harm. We don't come up with categories very often. There's injury and death. It's a big change that shifts mindsets and attitudes around safety. And again, a lot of this comes back to there is this very deep need for safety. And it comes back to the Epstein files as well, right? That we realize that so much of the structure of society has been designed intentionally against our best interests. I think dawned on a lot of people after the files came out was that most of the consumer culture of the 90s, mall culture, clothing aesthetics, like the way in which like the clothes that we wore, the fragrances, the models that we looked at.
And this entire narrative of like young female sexual awakening was engineered by this cabal
the aesthetic.
fucking deplorable people in the Epstein files. Okay, that brings me to my next topic, which is beauty, which is not just female, but it tends to be focused on female. I read this great piece, I think it was in Dazed today, about how there's a name for this emerging genre of body horror that's focused on beauty and the beauty industry specifically, and they call it goop horror. And I remember talking to Sarah Wendell, who's this romanticy expert who came and talked to us at Exposure Therapy last year, and she was talking about how, I asked her, okay, after romanticy, what do you think is the next thing we're going to start seeing in literature? And she's like, well, literature is where we go to kind of confront our fears and our desires. And she predicted body horror would be the next thing. And we happen to be seeing it in film now. And, it's interesting to see how, this very narrow future that we've lived with for a long time, engineered by the Epstein class, codified into culture around what beauty and femininity and a woman's literal, bodily value is. That branch, I wouldn't say is cut off, but it's getting a little banged up. There's little nicks that we're seeing in that branch. And there's this counter discussion now about the horror of beauty, the disgustingness of beauty. What was the Demi Moore movie? That kind of oh my God, hold on, I'm going to pull it up. It's okay. We don't need to cut this out. It's not the subtext. That's a great publication. The Substance, right. The Subtext is a great publication by my friend Carissa Justice that you guys should check out if you're into writing or brand strategy. But the Substance, as an example of body horror, but we see a lot of body horror cropping up in Asian film as well. I think it's a great start to the discussion because it leapfrogs all of the intellectualism. There's obviously a conversation to be had, but it makes you feel the horror behind the narrative that we've been living with.
Yeah. No, there's something that's really important there when, it makes me think of one of my favorite anecdotes is the movie Godzilla. When people understand the story of that, it changes how you see it, right? So just for a small history lesson, World War II happened and the US put a bunch of restrictions on Japanese media. They didn't want them talking about the bomb. They didn't want them talking about a lot of these things. So Godzilla came out of that. It was a movie about something that came out of nowhere and destroyed a city. It was a direct and very clear metaphor of the bomb, right? And it was their way of processing the feeling of what happened, to your point, because horror, especially horror, is our way of processing the fears of the time. And so, Godzilla is a wonderful metaphor of or example really of how we use media to process our experience of these things, because it's not the logic of it that we need to understand, it's the emotion that we need to understand. And you understand that when it's reflected back to you. That's why film and TV and media is so powerful for the collective sense making. And you can learn a lot about what are the stories that we're consuming. And to your point about body horror, 100%, we need to feel that, right? That there has been this sort of contortion of ourselves. And then we realize there's been strings behind it of how we've been contorting ourselves to fit into molds that we want to run as far away from as we can now. We realize what the intent behind those were. And I think that there is a deep rejection of that. It's not just that hey, we need something different. It's no, we need to get away. We need to reject that and move to something actively different, And I think that there is a lot of emotional energy there that we don't see played out in the market yet. But I think there is latent demand. And that's, again, the first signal is the horror movies. But there is a latent demand to act on that, to move away from that. And I think that, a figure I think is really interesting that leans into that is Chappell Roan. She's a figure that is, she's rejected her agent as soon as she knew they were associated. She doesn't have a public persona outside of her performance. She's not on social media. She's living her life. It's a very different way that she shows up. And I think she's an interesting signal of someone who isn't, contorting themselves to fit. She's kind of carving a different path. And I think that she represents something quite exciting in the landscape, especially around beauty and the mindset of how we appear and perform.
Remy Carlios, who's a friend and community member, also has a great Substack called La Nona Ora, which I recommend you guys read, that I find brilliant. But he talks about how this is what resistance often looks like. It's a refusal to make yourself smooth.
Yes.
It's to stay, pointy and uncomfortable. And Chappell Roan, because she was that kind of woman, could easily walk away from her label when maybe a lot of others could not. This also reminds me of something that Tressie McMillan Cottom talks about. I'm going to paraphrase what she said, this quote, and I hope I'm not getting it wrong, but essentially she says, of course, there's nothing wrong with beauty. It's the fact that we've made beauty, we've forced beauty to be consumable in the West, that we've perverted it. And I think that points to maybe the future that has died here. This kind of beauty that's easy to consume. We're complicating the story of beauty now, at least the story that we've been fed. We're revealing its ugly underside. And this simple story of how beauty is youth, and beauty is hairlessness, and beauty is smooth skin, and shiny long hair. Basically, the meme that you were talking about, where it's basically pedophilic. That might be a future that is dying.
100%. I think it ties into, some writing that we've done before about high fidelity society, about how, before beauty was very homogenous because society, it was like communicated over radio, like there was very low information bandwidth. And now, with social media, like you don't need to see all of culture. You find your niche and you exist within that bubble for better and worse. But the point there is that like, society can hold a lot more complexity, a lot more nuance, and a lot more multiplicity. And so it doesn't have to be one thing. It can be many things. And I think that that's what we're seeing. And, and it kind of ties to what we were talking about before about aspiration, that like it's, all of these things are symbols, right? But then what happens when we don't agree on what the symbols mean? Hairlessness means one thing to someone, but it means something very different to someone else who says, I reject that, right? And so all of a sudden, these aren't universal languages anymore, right? We have different views and beliefs. And so all this to say that I think beauty is becoming a far more complex landscape, and that changes the business landscape behind it, because instead of having one monolithic brand propping up one monolithic story of what it is, now you have many brands propping up many stories of what this looks like. And I think that's a much more healthy ecosystem.
I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this episode of Unseen Unknown. If you want to have more conversations like this, check out our community, Exposure Therapy, at exposuretherapy.com. And we announced this on our last episode, but I'll mention it again. We are launching a brand strategy masterclass on Maven. Just go to maven.com, look up brand strategy masterclass, and you will find us. Join us. That is going to be an excellent, excellent course for anybody that is looking for an end-to-end system for how to build a culture brand. And we will see you next time. Bye, everyone.